Hello, everybody. My name is Tasneem Gidi. I am championing Mexican Gothic by Sylvia Moreno Garcia on Canada Reads 2023. I'm actually here with Sylvia Moreno Garcia, the author of Mexican Gothic. Hi, Sylvia. How are you?
Hi, okay.
Perfect. So first, I wanted to tell you that the reason that I chose Mexican Gothic was actually this page here. When I saw it, it immediately reminded me of Scooby-Doo from when I was a kid. So that's why I immediately bought it. And then as I was reading it, it's just one of those books where you see that it's 1 a.m. and you know you have school or work in the morning, but something crazy happened and I just had to postpone sleep and just read it all in one night. So I definitely want to share that experience with everybody. So thank you so much for that. And that's why I want to champion it on Canada Reads. I really want to ask from you, like, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, one of the things that I really have enjoyed for a very long time are Gothic novels in general, the Gothic genre, which is very old. It goes, back to the late 1700s. And what happens is that there are a lot of tropes or motifs that we use nowadays still in our fiction, and we don't really know where they come from, but they harken back to Gothic fiction because it's been so old and it's been so used that some things have been incorporated into our culture almost by osmosis. And so there are several elements in that. And one of them is the Scooby-Doo mystery. One of the typical formats that the Gothic novel takes, because there are two types of Gothic, what is traditionally called by scholars the male Gothic, which would be the horror Gothic, the one that has supernatural elements. Those are your Draculas of the world.
Yeah.
And then what has been called by scholars traditionally the female Gothic is sometimes also called the romantic Gothic. And those are your Scooby-Doo plots. That's where a Jane Eyre type of woman goes into a mansion and she thinks there might be a ghost, but it turns out it's the mad woman in the attic, or it's the cousin that's trying to kill her, or some other mysterious shenanigan has some type of natural explanation. So there are mysteries mixed with a sense of romanticism. And so they're very interesting for that reason, because I find them to be a hybrid category that encompasses many things. Like I say, you've got your Dracula in one corner, but you also got your Jane Eyre in the other. And because it's so old, there's things that you don't even know you don't know where the mad, bad, and dangerous to no man comes from. The guy that, should you fear him, should you desire him? But it harkens back to a lot of those Gothics. So because of its long history, I really wanted to do something with it at one point, and Mexican Gothic was my way to kind of tackle that. And there are a lot of issues about colonialism, but we can talk about that later too.
Yeah. I always felt like, or when I picked it up, like horror is kind of an underappreciated genre, at least in the reader spaces that I occupy. So why do you think it's important to read books that scare us?
Well, horror is one of those very malign genres. I think romance is also overly malign, but horror, I think, probably gets the lowest of the low, because when I tell people I read horror or that I enjoy writing horror or I watch horror, the question is always why? Why do you do that? People think there's something wrong with you inherently. But what we call horror is this really broad category that has a long tradition. And I think one of the things that we like to do is we like to carve things out of genres. And so we kind of take the things that we think are good horror and we try to put them aside and say that's not horror. So we don't say, well, Edgar Allan Poe was a horror writer, although he wrote a number of horror stories. He also wrote mysteries, and he's the father of mystery, but he wrote horror. And we don't like to say, oh, Henry James is a horror writer, but he wrote a bunch of ghost stories, and some of them, definitely are horror stories, and Shirley Jackson. So we kind of like to parcel out certain people and say, no, these are good literary people, and then there's all this garbage. That distinction that we try to create often places horror kind of like in a bad light. But if you look at horror as this really broad spectrum that includes everything from more pulp fiction-y types of horror to stuff that might be more quiet, more about the suspense rather than the graphic action, and all its millions of shades in between, you really realize that it's a rich category that people just don't explore because they have all these biases against it. And it's really sad because sometimes I meet people and they tell me, oh, I don't like horror. Horror is nasty. And then they're like, I love the TV show Supernatural. And I really like I really like Carmilla, as a vampire lesbian story. Oh, and I think I really quite enjoyed that Shirley Jackson collection and Carmen Maria Machado. And I'm like, then you read horror, right? You're just
Yeah.
kind of like not wanting to kind of admit it. I think it just has this bad rep. Speculative fiction in general has kind of a bad rep because at least in the United States, it has a lot of intertwining with pulp fiction in the early years, in the early 20th century. And horror becomes an even worse case scenario of that.
Yeah, no, I like what you were saying earlier about colonialism, because one thing I didn't expect when going into it was how you kind of used the horror genre as kind of a vehicle to explore the themes of colonial violence and its effects. So, what are the biggest lessons in Mexican Gothic for Canadian readers?
Well, traditionally, Gothic fiction has a long relationship with the concept of the other in its fiction. And the way it manifests is that in Gothic fiction, the other is a threat that's always kind of coming in from the periphery and threatens to infect kind of white Protestant upper society. You see that in many ways. Dracula, for example, is kind of a Eastern European type that is literally infecting people with vampirism. And so he is an other. And there are other kinds of others. As you look at, as Gothics kind of evolve in the beginning, the other are Italians and Spaniards and Catholics. There's a lot of evil, mustache twirling Italians in early Gothic fiction and Anne Radcliffe. And they represent the other, that space of people that are not like us and that threaten us. But as the British Empire expands, the other begins to come in other places. You can see it in like, Indian magic, some kind of a monkey paw from India that could cause your demise. And you see it in shady characters, maybe from the Caribbean. Jane Eyre, the mad woman in the attic, she's a Caribbean Creole. So she's a white woman, but she has been raised in the Caribbean. And there's a lot of fear in that time period in the 1800s that people who are raised in the colonies are tainted by their association to the locals. They've gone native in that sense. So there's something bad about them. And you see that reflected over and over again in Gothic fiction. And with Mexican Gothic, what I was trying to do was to invert that really old relationship that happens in these kinds of stories, where the space that is the other is the British space that Noemi is entering in this novel as she heads into a village that has a British mining past, which is based on a real village in Mexico. And so she becomes kind of like the normal that in these stories would be the white Protestant male kind of dominant character. And the source of fear comes not from a black body or from a brown body, but it comes from literally people who are embodying colonial forces.
Speaking of Noemi, one of my favorite things about her is that she's a lot like me. We're both in university, we're both women in STEM. And I think, you could have easily written her off as someone who's just this socialite who doesn't really know much about the world. And I know you also have a master's in science. So I want to know, what was it like building a character like that?
Well, Noemi is really fun because she is a woman who wants to kind of explore some of the opportunities that are becoming available. Women have not earned the right to vote in Mexico in 1950 yet, but society is changing and there are opportunities and constraints where there are perhaps more opportunities than there were 20, 30 years before. And so she's kind of exploring some of that with the opportunity to try out certain career choices and perhaps pursue a master's degree. But she also has a lot of what might be considered frivolous pastimes or interests, like she likes fashion a lot, and she obviously enjoys parties. And at one point she says that it's a situation where a woman has to be one or the other. So you can be an intellectual but not a fashion guru, or you can be like a fashion guru but not an intellectual. You're a babe or a brain sort of situation. And she's navigating both of these kind of spaces. And I wanted to do that because I do think that even nowadays, women are often asked to just embody one aspect. I wanted to kind of explore that, to have somebody that has a lot of traditionally feminine pursuits, but also some traits that don't quite align with what we perceive femininity to be.
Yeah, no, even though this book was like written in 1950s, I still go through a lot of that and know a lot of my colleagues do. So that's why I resonated so much with Noemi, because one, she's a fashionista and she's so smart and was able to outwit everybody. So I genuinely appreciated her character in this book. Also, I did find this book, and this was the book that kind of got me into book talk. And I don't know if you're aware of the impact that it has in that community, but if you are, how do you feel like a small town in 1950s Mexico resonates with people today?
Yeah, that's weird. I don't have a TikTok account, so I don't hear about anything unless one of my friends forwards me something, which they sometimes do. They say, "Oh, look, somebody's talking about your book." Um, just, just kind of nice. Um, yeah, I mean, I like historical fiction in general. I just like going into the past and finding the commonalities between that and the present, or finding the threads that tie us to our present. And my master's degree is in science and technology studies, and my thesis work focused on eugenics, which is one of the topics of the book. And I remember when somebody kind of asked me, well, why are you studying that? What is the relevance nowadays of eugenics? You're talking about something that happened 100 years ago or
Mhm.
more. And since that person said it, like, and this was years ago, every few months I find some article or some news story that somehow ties to eugenics in the present sense, right? I can find and see those threads, and I can say that is, eugenic thought at work. And some of it crosses a lot into racialized categories and racism and colonialism and all that, and the role that eugenics plays in those kinds of discourses. But I've also found it like in medical discourse and things like that, kind of creeping in. And so I'm always really quite happy to look at those connections and look at the past. The past is very much not the past in many times, and especially for certain people, it is not really the past. For a lot of colonized people, it's not really like, well, that happened 50 years ago. What do you care? You ask Indigenous people in Canada about the past, and the past is still in the present, existing as a ghost, as a haunting that's still resonating through and echoing throughout our present. So I love history for that reason, and I don't know, maybe other people also find it interesting for that reason.